A few seconds on Google with the word South Africa will spew out results like a failing state, corruption, and high inflation. But through all the political jargon, South Africa seems to be good at one thing, and that is rugby. You see, it is hard to understand how a country that often leaves its citizens without power for the better part of 12 hours each day can muster up the courage to become the Rugby World Cup champions. Some might call it luck, and others will call the system rigged, but the fact of the matter is that the Springboks are the #1 team in the world. But how did a former British colony on the southern tip of the African continent, no more than 1.2 million square kilometres, or less than twice the size of Texas, become the most successful Rugby World Cup nation on the planet? Get ready as we explore the phenomenal rise of the mighty Springboks and how overcoming adversity, sanctions and political instability became the catalyst to draw one nation together on the grandest rugby stage of them all. The Springbok is one of the most popular wildlife attractions in South Africa. It bears a size none bigger than a common white-tailed deer, but much like the bald eagle and kiwi, it is native to one single country. However, its origin as a national crest for South Africa can be traced back almost 150 years. It was 1981 when South Africa played their first rugby game as the British Isles tour took place at Dethroned College. Whilst no real training took place, it was considered the first representative game as the British conglomerate won all 20 games against South Africa. The next tour, in 1896, saw the men from the north win 3 out of 4 tests, showing a significant improvement in rugby by the southern nation. But this tour from the British Isles would bring increasing press coverage to the game, sparking heavy interest from the natives. In fact, the third time these nations met would prove to be the tipping point, as the 1903 Test series saw the Lions lose their first ever series after drawing the first 2 games and losing 8-0 in the final match. This would continue with South Africa winning every series for the next 50 years, only tasting defeat again in 1956. South Africa became the first Southern Hemisphere nation to win the coveted Grand Slam, beating the 4 representing nations of the British Lions on British soil in a second European tour, which took place in 1912 and 1913. But as the First World War came around, South Africa and New Zealand had established themselves as the 2 greatest powers in the game. Now, I won't be diving too much into this rivalry as I created a video with links in the description on another page. By the end of the Second World War, things had significantly changed in the country of South Africa. The infamous apartheid regime was about to take over, and former South African legend Danny Craven was appointed coach in 1949. Under Craven, the Springboks would virtually destroy the world of rugby, going 10 in a row against all opposition. In fact, the 1949 Springboks whitewashed the All Blacks 4-0 in their tour of South Africa. The Boks continued this form for another decade before losing a series to New Zealand and France in the latter parts of the 1950s. However, tension inside the country was about to flare up, and the first highly adversarial part of the Springboks history would kick off. By 1960, the criticism of the apartheid regime had grown significantly, and after the notorious Sharpeville massacre, the Springboks became the target of international protests. However, it would take almost 20 years of nations touring to and from South Africa for the international community to finally take a stand against the brutal regime. It wasn't until 1976, shortly after the Soweto riots, that 28 nations boycotted the Summer Olympics in protest of South African participation in the international sporting events. This was followed by the Gleneagles Agreement of 1977, which discouraged every Commonwealth nation from competing with South Africa. However, New Zealand would defy this agreement with the 1981 Springboks Tour of New Zealand, which saw the Springboks lose the series 2-1. Perhaps the most instrumental part of that tour was when New Zealand fans pelted South African players with flour in protest of the apartheid regime. This also led to numerous civil disruptions in New Zealand. Due to these protests, the New Zealand High Court prevented another tour of South Africa, and the Springboks were left in isolation with only a few minor tours from 1986. But with Errol Tobias becoming the first non-white player to represent the Springboks and the game gaining traction inside prison under the black community, With Nelson Mandela even participating in prison games, things were about to change. With the apartheid regime officially abolished in 1991, the Springboks were readmitted to the international rugby in 1992. Unfortunately, years of isolation saw them struggle to return to form, and the Boks would lose most of their tours. It wouldn't be until 1995, when South Africa was granted the honour of hosting the Rugby World Cup, that things would change. Under the leadership of Francois Pienaar, and with Madiba Magic aiming to unify the country, the Springboks would win their first ever Webb Ellis trophy. But unfortunately, this seemed like a one-off, and after Springboks coach Kitch Christie resigned with an undefeated record in 1996 due to leukemia, the Springboks fell into disarray. In fact, the Boks barely managed to squeeze past nations like Australia and England, losing virtually every tournament. A quick resurgence would see them rise to third place in the 1999 Rugby World Cup before bowing out in the quarterfinals of the 2003 edition. In fact, the Springboks continually struggled to find form, winning the odd game here or there but never truly asserting themselves as a global superpower. But that run of form was about to change. As the 2007 Rugby World Cup came around, the old foe New Zealand was heavily touted to be the favourite. However, a loss against the host nation France in the quarterfinals gave the Boks the perfect opportunity. And under the tutelage of Jake White, the Boks would go on to win their second ever Webb Ellis trophy, tying Australia and being only the second nation to lift this coveted championship twice. In fact, the Springboks continued with a stellar run of form, with the mighty All Blacks being the only nation to truly rival them. By 2011, many believed it would be between the All Blacks and the Springboks to win the championship. But New Zealand had other plans and was on a roll with numerous winning seasons. Over the next 6 years, the All Blacks would win 2 successive Webb Ellis trophies, having what many would argue to be the greatest team to ever play the game. Unfortunately, South Africa was suffering, and poor leadership and coaching saw the Boks become one of the worst Tier 1 rugby nations, sinking below the top 5 in world rankings for the first time. In fact, the political divide in South Africa spread as the local government was pushing for the introduction of more players of colour, and this simply did not work. Topping all this, the losses gave the local population even more firepower to criticise a country that was already teetering on the brink of collapse, and many believed that the Springboks were done for good, with politics now running the show in South Africa. But much like Nelson Mandela, one man managed to turn this around and remove the political element while focusing on unifying all players and fans under one banner. You see, Rassie Erasmus might be on the lips of every rugby fan now, but many might not know he was formerly the captain of the Springboks side. While he could not muster up much as a player, Rassie had an affinity for coaching, and with his skills as a leader, he could unify players. During a time when South Africa desperately needed hope, Erasmus turned to the one man who was showing plenty of promise, and this was none other than Siya Kolisi. You see, Kolisi had the perfect backstory of a man raised in poverty, fighting his way to the top. In fact, his never-give-up attitude is what became the focal point of Springbok rugby. With Erasmus taking over in 2018, he had a mammoth task in front of him, with a young team lacking in confidence and an inexperienced captain to lead them. However, Erasmus kept his young side and focused on building around them, giving Siya the benefit of the doubt, but trusting that he would grow into stature as captain. As the Springboks entered the 2019 Rugby World Cup, they were still rebuilding, and no one gave them a shot over the Irish and the dominant All Blacks. However, England would do some of the work for the Boks, knocking out New Zealand in the semi-final and setting up an English Springboks rematch in the finals. This is where the brilliance of Erasmus would shine, motivating the nation to rally behind the Springboks and putting all the focus on Siya Kolisi. Eventually, South Africa ran out victors, securing their third Webb Ellis trophy and solidifying the team as one of the greats. But all of the players were still under the age of 30. During the next 4 years, Erasmus would step down as coach, but with Jacques Nienaber in the role, he continued with insights and mentoring. In fact, Erasmus would be the catalyst to keep the Springboks at the top of the world rankings for the better part of the next 4 years. But once again, the Springboks entered the 2023 Rugby World Cup with numerous injuries and locked in the pool of death with favourites Ireland. After losing against the Irish, it was believed that Erasmus and his Chargers had finally met their match. However, the genius himself would conjure up magic, beating France and England in the playoffs by a single point. With everyone now showing some hope, many still thought the All Blacks would demolish them in the final, but once again, a single point saw the Springboks lift the Webb Ellis Trophy for a fourth time. This would finally solidify the Springboks as the most successful rugby nation to play the Rugby World Cup, having won 4 out of their 8 attempts, a record that no other team can even dream to imagine. But with all the success and history, one thing has remained a common theme. You see, the first Rugby World Cup victory came on the back of Nelson Mandela unifying a nation. In 2007, the same process was happening, and for the final 2 editions, kolisi was vocal about uniting the nation under the same flag. Thanks to a few men willing to sacrifice their pride and focus on unifying the nation, the Springboks managed to overcome the odds each time. And perhaps that is the secret to their success. But what do you think made the Boks the greatest nation on the planet?